My name is Lucy, and the day my marriage cracked open was not during a loud argument or a dramatic confession. It happened while my husband and I stood inside a sleek, sun-drenched condo on the 12th floor, listening to a German expat describe the view. I stood there with a pleasant, blank expression, pretending I didn't understand a single word of what was being said. But then I heard one sentence that split my world in half, a truth spoken in a language I was never supposed to know. For 15 years I had been the safe wife, the agreeable one who kept her head down and the household running smoothly. Ethan liked it that way. At 45, he had a booming career, a commanding voice, and a firm belief that his perspective was the only one that mattered. I was a 39-year-old accountant with a habit of swallowing my thoughts before they ever reached my lips. Over the years, I had learned to move through our home softly, avoiding his irritation the way one avoids sharp edges in a dark room. I made myself smaller in every conversation, every decision, and every room we shared. I had convinced myself that silence was the price of peace. But as we rode the elevator up to that viewing, something inside me shifted. It was a faint, steady tapping in my chest, a reminder that the life I was living wasn't the only one possible. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to hear a truth that would force me to stop hiding. For most people, home is the place where they finally exhale. For 15 years I had been holding my breath. Our apartment was a testament to Ethan's aesthetic, a collection of cold marble, sharp angles, and expensive glass. In the beginning, I had tried to suggest softer colors or a different layout for the furniture, but Ethan would simply tilt his head, offer a condescending smile, and explain why my taste lacked vision. After a few years, I stopped suggesting things. I learned that the easiest way to live in Ethan's world was to become as unobtrusive as the air within it. I became a master of disappearing while standing in plain sight. I learned the exact pressure to apply to the floorboards so they wouldn't creak, the precise volume of a laugh that would acknowledge his jokes without being distracting, and the art of folding my desires into small, invisible shapes that could be tucked away in the back of a drawer. My daily life was a series of careful calculations designed to keep his irritation at bay. If the coffee was too hot, it was an inconvenience. If I stayed too late at the office, it was a personal slight against his schedule. I moved through our rooms like a ghost, avoiding the sharp edges of his temperament. It wasn't that he was a monster. He was just a man who believed his presence was the sun around which everything else was required to orbit. And for 15 years I had been a loyal moon, reflecting his light and hiding my dark side. The only place where I felt a flicker of my own identity was at my desk at a small, unassuming accounting firm downtown. It was a modest job, far below the high-powered career Ethan imagined for himself, but I loved the absolute clarity of the numbers. On a ledger, everything had to balance. There was no room for dominance or vision in a column of figures. There was only the truth. My colleagues saw me as the quiet, reliable Lucy who never made a mistake and never made a scene. They didn't know that my mind was a sharp, analytical tool that I kept honed in secret. At the office, I wasn't Ethan's wife. I was an expert in balance. But the moment I turned my key in our front door at 5:30 p.m., I felt the familiar weight of the shrink settle over my shoulders. I would take a breath, let it out slowly, and prepare to spend the evening agreeing with a man who looked at me but didn't actually see me. I was 39 years old, and I had become so good at disappearing that I was starting to wonder if there was anything left of the woman who had existed before the silence took over. The blue light of the television flooded our living room, flickering against the cold marble surfaces as the sounds of tires screeching and distant explosions filled the air. Ethan sat in his leather recliner, his eyes fixed on the screen, a half-smirk on his face whenever the hero on screen took charge. This was our evening ritual. A loud, one-sided experience where the volume was always a few decibels too high for comfort, but I never asked him to turn it down. To ask was to invite a lecture on the quality of the sound system, or a sigh that suggested I was being difficult. So I sat on the far end of the sofa, a book in my lap that I wasn't really reading, existing in the space he allowed me to occupy. I reached for my phone, the movement small and practiced. Usually, I'd scroll through work emails or check the weather, anything to look occupied without being distracting. But that night, an ad for a language app caught my eye. Learn German in 15 minutes a day, it promised. It felt like a ridiculous impulse, a spark of curiosity in a life that had become a dull gray. German was the language of Ethan's business partners, the tongue he used during late-night conference calls to sound authoritative and worldly. It was a world he kept entirely separate from me, often telling me it was too complex for someone who didn't grow up with it. With a quick glance toward the recliner to ensure he was still lost in the movie's climax, I tapped the download button. The silent click of the icon felt like the turning of a lock. When the app opened, I muted the volume and began the first lesson. Guten Abend. Good evening. I mouthed the words silently, the foreign sounds feeling strange and sharp against the roof of my mouth. There was a sudden, intoxicating thrill in it. For 15 years, every part of my life had been vetted, critiqued, or managed by Ethan. He knew what I ate, what I wore, and how I spent my weekends. But he didn't know about this. As the explosions on the TV reached a deafening roar, I was building a secret room inside my own mind, a place where he wasn't invited. I wasn't just learning words. I was reclaiming a piece of my own territory. Each correct answer on the screen felt like a tiny, invisible victory. I looked over at Ethan, who was shouting at the screen, and I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips. He thought I was just sitting there, disappearing into the upholstery as usual. He had no idea that behind my quiet expression, I was finally starting to speak. In the weeks that followed, my secret life took on a physical shape. It existed in the small, spiral-bound notebook I kept tucked between the mattress and the bed frame, and in the heavy silence of the house after Ethan had fallen asleep. Every night, I waited for the rhythmic, heavy breathing that signaled he was dead to the world, a sound that used to make me feel lonely but now felt like a starting pistol. Only then would I reach for the flashlight I'd hidden in my nightstand, pulling the duvet over my head to create a private, glowing sanctuary of polyester and light. Under the covers, the air was warm and smelled of laundry detergent, a cramped space that felt larger than our entire apartment because it was mine alone. I would click on the flashlight, the beam illuminating columns of verbs and grammar charts I'd painstakingly copied during my lunch breaks at the office. Bin du bist der ist. I traced the letters with my finger, memorizing the sharp, logical structure of the sentences. There was a profound, quiet thrill in the work. For 15 years, Ethan had curated my reality, deciding which news was worth hearing and which books were worth reading. But he couldn't touch this. He didn't even know it existed. During the day, the secret lived behind my teeth. When Ethan would launch into a monologue about his international vision, or mock the inefficiency of his European counterparts, I would simply nod, my face a mask of practiced neutrality. Inside, however, I was translating his arrogance into the language he thought I was too simple to grasp. I started to see the world in two layers: the small, restricted life Ethan allowed me to lead, and the expanding landscape of my own mind. Knowing something he didn't felt like carrying a concealed weapon. It was the first time in our marriage that the power dynamic had shifted, even if only in the dark. As I studied the cases, nominative, accusative, dative, I wasn't just learning a language. I was building a ladder. Every new word was a rung, a way to climb out of the hole I had spent a decade digging for myself. I would eventually click the flashlight off, my eyes stinging from the strain, and tuck the notebook back into its hiding place. I'd lie there in the dark, listening to the man beside me, no longer feeling like a ghost, but like a woman waiting for the right moment to finally haunt her own life. The elevator rose with a silent, pressurized efficiency that made my ears pop, the digital floor numbers climbing steadily toward 12. Beside me, Ethan adjusted his silk tie in the mirrored walls, checking his reflection with the practiced air of a man who expected the world to be his stage. He didn't look at me, but he reached out and patted my hand, not as a gesture of affection, but as one might steady a piece of luggage. It was a silent command to be presentable, to be quiet, and to follow his lead. When the doors slid open, we were met by a flood of mid-morning light and the smell of expensive floor wax. Hans Ritter was already there, standing by a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city's industrial pulse. He was a man of precise movements and kind eyes, greeting us with a slight, formal bow. "Thank you for coming," Hans said, his English accented but clear. "It is a beautiful space, yes?" Ethan stepped forward before I could even draw a breath, his hand extended as he launched into his managerial persona. "Impressive, Hans. Very impressive. Of course, we've seen quite a few properties this week, but I told my wife we should at least give this one a look-see." He glanced back at me, that familiar condescension flickering in his eyes, a look that said I was lucky he had invited me along for the ride. "Lucy, don't just stand by the door. Come look at the kitchen. It's got that high-end cabinetry I know you like to look at." I walked across the polished wood, my heels clicking like a countdown. I felt Hans's gaze linger on me, perhaps sensing the odd friction between my husband's booming confidence and my own practiced stillness. Ethan was already moving through the rooms as if he already owned them, running a finger along the marble counters and critiquing the lighting fixtures with an unearned authority. He spoke to Hans with a forced camaraderie, the kind he used when he wanted to remind someone that he was the one with the checkbook. "It's a bit more contemporary than our current place," Ethan said, turning back to me with a smirk. "Might be a bit much for you to keep clean, wouldn't it, Luce? A lot of glass to smudge." He laughed, a sharp, jarring sound, and turned back to Hans, assuming I would simply drift into the background as usual. I saw the way he looked at me, as a decorative appendage, a variable to be managed rather than a partner to be consulted. But as I stood there, staring out at the horizon, I felt the notebook tucked into my mind. I watched Hans and Ethan begin to talk in lower tones, and for the first time I didn't feel small. I felt like an observer watching a play I already knew the ending to. I was waiting for the moment the language would change, and I was ready to hear every word. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the penthouse floor, Hans leaned against the marble island and shifted the conversation into his native tongue. I saw the relief in his posture, a man glad to set aside the clunky mechanics of a secondary language to discuss the serious business of contracts. "Also," Hans began, his German flowing with a crisp, rhythmic precision I had only ever heard through my headphones in the dark. "Wir müssen über die Eigentum Cirken sprechen. Worden beide Namen darauf stehen." He was asking about the deed. He was asking if both our names would be on it. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest, but I kept my eyes fixed on the view of the harbor, my face a mask of mild, bored curiosity. Ethan didn't hesitate. He leaned in, his voice dropping into that confidential, man-to-man register he used when he was closing a deal. "Eigentlich," Ethan replied, his German surprisingly proficient but laced with a cold, calculated edge. "Wordner mein Name darauf stehen. Mein Frau kümmert sich nicht solche Dinge. Es ist besser, wenn ich alles verwalte. Actually, only my name will be on it. My wife doesn't care for such things. It's better if I manage everything." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood rush to my ears, but I didn't flinch. I watched a seagull dip and dive outside the glass, counting my breaths. Hans frowned slightly, his gaze flicking toward me for a fraction of a second, checking for a reaction I was careful not to give. "Sind Sie sicher? Unsass. In Deutschland ist dies üblich, das beide Hauptpartner." Ja, Ethan interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "Hier ist dies anders. Sie verstet ohnehin nix von Finanzen. Sie ist glücklich, solange die Küche ist. She understands nothing of finances anyway. She is happy as long as the kitchen is nice." Ethan turned to me then, his expression shifting instantly back to that patronizing, indulgent smile he saved for the agreeable wife. "Hans was just explaining the technicalities of the heating system, Lucy. Boring stuff. He says the maintenance fees are a bit high, but I told him I'd handle the paperwork and the costs. You don't need to worry your head about the boring legal bits." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time the man I had lived with for 15 years looked like a stranger. He wasn't just translating. He was rewriting my existence in real time. He was standing in a room I had helped pay for, with a woman who spent her days balancing corporate ledgers, and he was telling a stranger I was a child. Is that right? I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. That's right, honey, he said, turning back to Hans with a smirk, confident that his secret was safe behind a language barrier he thought I was too small to climb. I realized then that the safe marriage I had been protecting was a cage, and the lock was finally within my reach. Hans adjusted his glasses, his expression clouding with a visible, professional discomfort. He looked from Ethan's smug, relaxed face to me, as I continued to trace the grain of the marble countertop with a detached focus. Aber Herr Collins, Hans pressed, his voice dropping into a more serious tone. Das ist eine rebellische Investition. Wenn ihr Frau auch arbeitet, wäre es doch nur fair. Ethan let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound that dismissed the very idea of fairness as a quaint, foreign concept. He leaned back against the kitchen island, crossing his arms over his chest in a posture of absolute authority. Glauben Sie mir, Hans, he said in German, his tone dripping with a casual, devastating cruelty. Es spielt keine Rolle. Sie ist ein jemand in dieser Gleichung. Sie verstet ohnehin nix von Vertragen oder Finanzen. Sie unterschreitet einfach was ich ihr vorlege. She is a nobody in this equation. She understands nothing of contracts or finances anyway. She simply signs whatever I put in front of her. I felt a coldness settle over me, a stillness so profound it felt like the world had stopped turning. I had spent 15 years trying to be the woman he wanted, shrinking myself until I was nearly translucent, all for the sake of a piece that was actually just my own slow erasure. And there he was, using the language of his international vision, to strip away the last of my dignity to a complete stranger. Sie ist wie ein Kind, Ethan continued, warming to his theme as he saw Hans's hesitation. Man gibt ein Chance Zimmer und ein wenig Tastengeld und es ist zufrieden. Warum sollte man die Bürokratie verkomplizieren, wenn sie ohnehin keinen Beitrag leistet? She's like a child. You give her a beautiful room and a little pocket money, and she is content. Why complicate the bureaucracy when she contributes nothing anyway? Hans looked away, clearly embarrassed to be part of such a lopsided conversation. Ethan, sensing he had won the point, turned back to me and switched to English, his voice returning to that oily, patronizing sweetness. Hans is just saying the paperwork can be a real headache, Lucy. He thinks it's best if we keep things simple and just put it in my name to save time on the international filings. You don't mind, do you, sweetheart? It's just more of those boring numbers you hate. I looked up then, meeting his eyes. For the first time in a decade, I didn't blink. I didn't look down. I didn't offer the submissive smile that usually smoothed over his arrogance. I simply stared at him, seeing the smallness of the man behind the expensive suit and the loud voice. I don't mind keeping things simple, Ethan, I said, my voice as level and sharp as a scalpel. In fact, I think it's time we made things very simple indeed. He frowned, the first flicker of confusion crossing his face. He didn't know that the child had just grown up, and the nobody was about to become the only person in the room who mattered. The car ride home was a suffocating tunnel of silence. Ethan hummed a tuneless, self-satisfied melody under his breath, his fingers drumming against the leather steering wheel in time with his victory. He looked like a man who had just successfully navigated a difficult transaction, his ego inflated by the ease with which he had bypassed me. I watched the city blur past the window, the neon signs and streetlights bleeding into long, jagged lines of color. Inside, however, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of the new words I had gathered, the verbs and syntax lining up like soldiers ready for battle. The moment we stepped through the front door, Ethan tossed his keys onto the marble console with a sharp metallic clatter. Well, that went perfectly, he said, heading toward the kitchen to pour himself a celebratory drink. Hans is a bit traditional, but I handled him. It's better this way, Lucy. One name, one signature, no complications. You'll thank me when you don't have to deal with the taxes. He turned to me, his drink in hand, expecting the usual nod, the quiet if you think so, Ethan, that had served as the soundtrack to our marriage. Instead, he found me standing in the center of the rug, my coat still on, watching him with a terrifying clarity. Es war also ein rein Formsake, said. The glass paused halfway to his lips. He froze, his brow furrowing in a mask of genuine confusion. What did you say? Ich have gefragt ob es ein rein Formsk war, I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, steady and cold. Oder war es einfach nur ein Feature, Michigan wie ein Fremd in meinem eigenen Leben zu behandeln? I asked if it was a formality, or was it just easier to treat me like a stranger in my own life? The color drained from his face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. He nearly choked on his swallow of whiskey, coughing as he slammed the glass down on the counter. Lucy. What, how long? Lang genig zu wissen, dass du Michigan für ihn kein Holst, I continued, stepping into the light of the kitchen. Lang genig zu hören, dass ich für dich ein jemand bin. Long enough to know you think I'm a child. Long enough to hear that I am a nobody to you. Lucy, stop it, he stammered, his English returning as a panicked defense mechanism. I don't know what game you're playing, but... Das ist kein Spiel, Ethan, I interrupted, the German words feeling more honest than English ever had in this house. Es ist das Ende deiner Lügen. This isn't a game. It's the end of your lies. For the first time in 15 years he looked small. The commanding voice, the international vision, the arrogance, it all collapsed under the weight of a truth he never saw coming. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The language he used to exclude me was the very thing I used to set myself free. I turned away from him, leaving him standing in his cold marble kitchen, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care if the floorboards creaked. The silence of my new apartment was not the heavy, suffocating kind I had grown used to in Ethan's shadow. It was a wide, open space that smelled of lemon polish and possibility. Packing my life into boxes had taken less time than I expected. When you spend 15 years making yourself smaller, you realize you don't actually own very much. I had walked out of the house with my clothes, my accounting designations, and the spiral-bound notebook that had become my lifeline. As I sat on the floor of my living room, the city lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars outside the window, I picked up the phone. I didn't call a lawyer first. I called Hans Ritter. Herr Ritter, I said, and the language felt like silk on my tongue, no longer a secret kept under blankets. Hier ist Lucy Collins. Ich möchte über das Apartment sprechen. Alien. There was a long pause on the other end, the silence of a man re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about a nobody. Then a soft, respectful chuckle. Frau Collins. I thought I detected a spark behind your silence that day. I would be honored to discuss a fair deal with the person who actually understands the numbers. Hans didn't just sell me the condo. He became the first person to truly see the professional I had suppressed. Through his network, I was introduced to a prestigious international firm looking for an auditor with a mastery of European tax law and a fluency in German. The interview was the first time I didn't shrink in a room full of powerful men. When the lead partner switched to German to test my proficiency, I didn't just pass. I led the conversation. I spoke about balance sheets and cross-border assets with a clarity that had Ethan's managerial voice sounding like a distant, fading radio signal. For the first time in my life, I wasn't an inconvenience or a dependent. I was an asset. When I signed my employment contract and the deed to my home on the same afternoon, I didn't check with anyone for approval. I didn't look for a patronizing smile. I simply uncapped my pen and wrote my name alone, in firm, unwavering strokes. Standing on my balcony that evening, looking out at the 12th floor view I had earned for myself, I took a breath. It was deep, filling my lungs until they ached, and then I let it out. The great exhale had finally come. I was no longer holding my breath, waiting for someone else to tell me the world was safe. I had built my own world, and for the first time in 39 years, the air was perfectly clear. The golden hour light draped across my new balcony, softening the edges of the city skyline. It had been exactly 1 year since I walked out of that 12th floor penthouse with nothing but a notebook and a newfound refusal to be silenced. My own home was smaller than the marble museum I had shared with Ethan, but every piece of furniture, every splash of color on the walls, and every book on the shelves was a choice I had made without seeking permission. Julian stood beside me, leaning against the railing with an easy, unforced grace. He didn't pace or dominate the space. He simply existed within it, comfortable in the quiet. When he spoke, it wasn't to lecture or to fill the air with the sound of his own authority. "The light is incredible this evening, Lucy," he said, glancing at me with a smile that reached his eyes. "You were right about the western exposure. It changes everything." "It does," I replied, and I felt the weight of my own voice, steady, clear, and resonant. For 15 years, I had treated my thoughts like contraband, hiding them away to avoid the friction of Ethan's ego. I had spent a lifetime learning the complex vocabulary of submission, becoming fluent in the yes that kept the peace but eroded my soul. But as I looked at Julian, and then back at the life I had built with my own hands and my own mind, I realized that the most difficult language I had ever mastered wasn't German. It was the simple monosyllabic strength of the word no. No to being managed. No to being a nobody in my own marriage. No to the idea that my intelligence was a threat or an inconvenience. Julian reached out, his hand hovering for a second before gently covering mine on the railing. It wasn't a gesture of ownership or a command to stay still. It was a question, an invitation to connect. I didn't pull away, nor did I feel the old instinctive urge to shrink. I stood my ground, my posture tall and my breath deep. I thought back to the woman who had studied grammar charts under a duvet, trembling with the fear of being caught. She felt like a distant relative now, a ghost I had finally laid to rest. I had learned that silence doesn't protect you. It only invites more noise from those who wish to drown you out. "A penny for them?" Julian asked softly. I leaned my head back, letting the cool evening breeze brush against my face. I was just thinking that for a long time I thought I was lost. But it turns out I was just waiting for the right language to find myself. I took a sip of my wine, the taste crisp and bright, and looked out over the city. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, but I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. I had my own light now, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I wanted to say.